All right, I think we can get started. Thank you everyone for tuning in. My name is Aaron. I'm a project manager on the Mocaverse project. Um, with me, Francis as well, who's Crypto Credo as a speaker. And of course, we're very happy to have Yatsu, our co-founder and executive chairman of Animoca Brands. Hey, Yat, good evening.
Hello there. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Let's get started. So the purpose of today's AMA is just to share a little bit more about the Mocaverse project. I know there's been a lot of excitement from the community and a lot of good positive feedback. So I think we're taking the time today, to share with the community what we can all expect from Mocaverse and as well as how it plays with the Animoca ecosystem. Yeah, so maybe we can kick it off. Just a quick note to the audience. You can feel free to submit your questions through Twitter. You can submit them on our latest post, as well as at the end of this AMA, we'll invite people up to the stage to ask questions as well. Great. Yeah, thank you for being here tonight. So maybe we can kick it off with a simple question. What is the Mocaverse?
Well, some of you have already heard some of the stuff about it or read some of it already. But really, in summary, the Mocaverse is the beginning of a movement within Animoca to decentralize ourselves as an organization, to basically bring, the community that is Animoca, that consists of, obviously the members of Animoca that sort of work here, our group companies, our investment portfolios, our community, our customer owners, and just about everyone else that sort of we touch both directly and indirectly into the space. So obviously we're beginning that in multiple stages, and Mocaverse is that initial stage in which we create a way in which our sort of community has a kind of quasi-ownership over the things that Animoca does, and not as a shareholder per se, but basically as a stakeholder, which is a belief that we have put out earlier on as well, before. And there's a distinction to be made that obviously the shareholders of Animoca Brands are obviously the ones who have the sort of the financial benefits and the standard background and our earliest backers and so on. But how do we get to a way in which we can have the community that makes Animoca as well, even though they are not necessarily shareholders, have a way in which they sort of have a say and a kind of governance and an influence in the ecosystem that we're building as we are building it together. That's kind of the ethos behind it. I think, as time goes on, we'll discuss some more of the elements around it, but broadly speaking, that's the ethos. Just for everyone who's not sort of too familiar with Animoca, we're a company that has been building this space now for almost 5 years, which I suppose in the NFT space is quite a long time since it hasn't been around for that long. In our portfolio today, for instance, we have well over 380 companies. Some of these companies include companies like Sky Mavis from Axie Infinity, of Axie Infinity fame, OpenSea, Dapper Labs, Decentraland. Of course, we're also the owners of the Sandbox and Phantom Galaxies. We're also investors in Yuga Labs, and obviously helped sort of launch Apecoin. Investors also in Cool Cats. So a whole series of what we consider some of the marquee names in the sort of crypto culture space, which is embodied with NFTs. And so the next step now is us as an organization, how do we basically have a way in which our broader community has some form of influence and can be rewarded, but also has a way in which they can help guide the direction of what we do as well. So that's sort of really what the Mocaverse is all about. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's super interesting and really, really great how that ties in with the Animoca Brands ethos, right? With digital property rights and decentralization at the heart of it. So is it a metaverse? Because, noting the name Mocaverse, metaverse is quite similar. Is that kind of the direction that this project is heading in?
Sorry, I didn't hear I didn't hear the question. Sorry, that you just skipped out there.
Or,
Could you say that again? Yeah.
yeah. So is it a metaverse? Are we heading towards this because the names are so similar?
Well, no. So, I mean, I think it's not to be looked at. Mocaverse is not trying to be sort of a sandbox, for instance, in the same sense. If you think about Animoca Brands, it has made investments in many of the metaverses that are being built, for instance, and has played a role and a hand in them, whether this is something like the Sandbox, or whether this is, for instance, the other side, or whether this is our involvement in Decentraland or in the early days, or, what we're doing in Phantom Galaxies or Life Beyond, right? These are all different type of metaverses that are being built that we're supportive of. We have said many times that we believe in the future that there's going to be multiple metaverses in the same way that there's multiple countries and multiple cultures. We think that's really, really important. So what the Mocaverse should be viewed as almost like a kind of, let's call it the Animoca universe, as opposed to the Animoca metaverse per se as a place, but rather as a as a way in which all the people within the space, that includes portfolios and community and customers or anyone who else would love to get involved in, has a way in which they could sort of get access to what we're doing, understand it better, learn about sort of our emphasis in crypto culture in areas of NFTs, and sort of create interoperability in the space as well, right? So there's a few ways which we believe interoperability will take place. One of them is going to be obviously through people who compose freely with their assets, but another one will also be where organizations like ourselves will help facilitate these type of interoperability experiences. And so that's a part of what the Mocaverse is about. So we should look at the Mocaverse really as a kind of sort of engine for growth for these various metaverses that we're helping construct either directly or indirectly, but not necessarily as a metaverse in and of itself, the way that you would think of, say, the other side or Sandbox.
Okay. No, thanks for clearing that up. So I think a lot of the community have been super excited, right? Because this is Animoca Brand's first official PFP NFT collection. So what was the kind of, I guess what was the idea behind it, and why did Animoca choose to launch PFP of their own?
I mean, I think, again, one of the biggest areas that the PFP movement has actually demonstrated as a key part of crypto culture is membership in a community. And so what's the best way to do that? So Animoca Brands is already itself sort of a member in many communities directly. For instance, we hold probably one of the largest sort of NFT banks in the world when it comes to our ownership of, whether it's Bored Apes or Land in Sandbox or sort of, Cool Cats or whichever items, we do. We have a very, very large sort of quantum of NFT assets that, obviously we now have to think of the next step into what's the best way in which you can create decentralized governance within them, right? As an example. And so really the idea behind this also was that to add sort of areas of governance between that as well. If you are, for instance, a sort of a holder of Mocaverse NFTs, then, what type of sort of governance rights do you have amongst the type of communities in which Animoca has an involvement in, for instance, right? So that's kind of a part of how we thought about sort of the construction of this one. And the hope, of course, is that this basically moves Animoca itself into that next step of what we talk about, which is sort of stakeholder capitalism, where people themselves then have a say in sort of where things go in a variety of these different projects that are out there. And the PFP movement is the embodiment, is sort of really, if you think about it, one of the strongest crypto culture signals. It's of membership, right? It's obviously, I guess you could say, it really started with CryptoPunks in a way, but obviously it became sort of embodied, more sort of prominently with Bored Ape, for instance, and of course Cool Cats and all the other amazing projects that are out there that are doing that as a way to signal sort of your community. And for us with Mocaverse, how do we create a sort of a signal that you're part of the community that is Animoca Brands, that embodies essentially our ownership in a variety of these sort of important NFT projects, moves Animoca itself into that next step of what we talk about, which is sort of stakeholder capitalism, where people themselves then have a say in sort of where things go in a variety of these different projects that are out there. And the PFP movement is the embodiment, is sort of really, if you think about it, one of the strongest crypto culture signals. It's of membership, right? It's obviously, I guess you could say, it really started with CryptoPunks in a way, but obviously it became sort of embodied, more sort of prominently with Bored Ape, for instance, and of course Cool Cats and all the other amazing projects that are out there that are doing that as a way to signal sort of your community. And for us with Mocaverse, how do we create a sort of a signal that you're part of the community that is Animoca Brands, that embodies essentially our ownership in a variety of these sort of important NFT projects and have a say in this? Because that's the other thing, right? When we think about, for instance, decentralization isn't just decentralizing, basically one project in and of itself. It's also how basically other areas influence each other, kind of like how you do in global trade. One of the things about Web3 is that everything's interconnected. If you're on the Ethereum blockchain, for instance, or whether you bridge through another chain, you're invariably affected by one project or the other, right? So Bored Apes, for instance, has an indirect sort of effect on multiple other projects, perhaps in good or in bad ways, for instance. And these all are things that affect each other. So that means Animoca Brands and sort of the Mocaverse has also an impact onto these projects with it directly and indirectly. How do we find a way in which that sort of can sort of transfer over to a broader community that might not be yet a member in this, or is maybe already a member in this, and would like to have sort of an additional exposure to other NFT projects through that, or cryptocurrency projects through that mechanism. That is sort of how we were hoping Mocaverse could work, because we are probably the only company in the world right now that has such a broad exposure in crypto culture from an investment and from an ownership perspective. And so we can probably offer a unique offering in relation to that, and thereby also broadening essentially the onboarding of Web3, which sometimes can be viewed as quite exclusive if it's only going from one membership to another membership. But maybe this is a way in which you can have a kind of cross-owner membership through the Mocaverse.
No, yeah, thank you for spelling that out. Yeah, I think since we announced the launch of the Mocaverse project a couple of weeks back, the community have been really excited as well about the prospect, right, of the current Animoca Brands network and that interoperability that you mentioned, and that have the community have been speculating, hey, what kind of utilities would this PFP give you? Obviously, we're well connected across the space, but maybe you could share a little bit more. Yeah, what does the utility look like for this project?
So there's multiple areas of utility that we're already sort of contemplating. To be clear, not all of the utility that we have right now is going to happen on day one, but I'll give you a few concrete examples that we're actually thinking about that haven't been finalized, but it does matter, right? So, and I give you sort of a live example, for instance, which is, and again, take this as a sort of work in progress as opposed to something that is sort of set in stone. But when you take a look at, for instance, right now a project like ApeCoin, which is fairly prominent, obviously, and we had a hand in helping launch it. We obviously, as a result of that, have been sitting on a fair amount of governance tokens in this example. But we have never voted any of our company reserves in these governance tokens for good reason, right? Partially because of the fact that this is obviously one that we want to make sure that has more of the ethos of community owned, and the other one, of course, is that we have to be mindful, obviously, in terms of the early stages that we sort of, basically respect and share the ethos of everything that is to help grow it in as much a decentralized way as possible. If you are a Mocaverse NFT holder, one of the potential possibilities that might arise is that you could then basically have it becomes a delegated stake holding, right? And because it's, we plan to basically distribute Mocaverse NFTs in a manner where Animoca Brands itself will never have a majority. And in fact, most of it is going to be distributed pretty much from the get-go, whether it's to community owners, whether it's through a mint, whether it's through basically our shareholders, basically which comprise some of our investors, as well as basically companies who are companies we invested in, right? Which is a very broad basis, right? And we feel that is a basis of people who understand the world of NFTs fairly well, because they are one of those earliest communities that we helped seed. So that means that they understand areas of governance. They may understand DAOs perhaps reasonably well. So what if we, for instance, provided a part of sort of our governance tokens in various projects, which may include ApeCoin, but also other projects, and have them basically, as a community, have a certain percentage decide where things might go from a voting perspective, if that's what they would do. And where Animoca Brands basically hands over essentially the voting elements and controls over these tokens over to the community directly, further decentralizing, becoming basically a kind of delegate, but without Animoca itself basically deciding it, but rather basically giving it to its community that had a hand in helping sort of build Animoca to where it is today. So that's kind of one of those sort of ideas, which itself has a few effects. The first one is that it would allow people to learn more about sort of actually what governance and DAOs really means, because that's still a fairly new thing. Most people don't fully appreciate and understand essentially how that works. So that's a big quest for us, because in order to have decentralization really truly work, we need to basically do a lot of work in educating how DAOs work and why it's important that we sort of continue that effort. And we're still early in this development. So that's one effect. The other one, of course, is that for a number of these projects, it can be considered fairly expensive to sort of enter these markets. And there is something to be said about needing to be invested in them. But if you have not a sort of outsized position, but you have some reasonable influence, it's a way in which you can start to sort of baby step your way into basically public governance and have a say into things. And hopefully then it can help evolve other projects and other DAOs, and obviously engage the community more deeply as well into this area, right? So that's kind of an example. The other one, of course, is the more sort of obvious membership examples that you get. For instance, we run events all over the world. Most recently, we had one in London. These are events that are typically fairly fairly busy. We're not really able to sort of accommodate everyone. So again, this is in a way in which we can allow people to sort of participate in the events, meet all the other people from Animoca or its portfolio, potentially also get access to our investment team for opportunities, for instance, discuss with our project teams directly, maybe even have sort of kind of open office environment, all these type of benefits that we basically provide to portfolio companies. We can then also look at extending in part basically to people who hold these NFTs as become part of the community. So these are sort of things that we're developing as part of the various types of utilities that we can expand. And ultimately, you should also expect that our portfolios itself will very likely also provide different types of utilities for Mocaverse NFT holders as a result of the network effect that's already being constructed around it, because it benefits all parties.
Thanks, yeah. And yeah, I know the team here have been working hard to put together those utilities and through the different realms as well. So we have do good, learn together, play together, and build together, right? So under those four kind of key themes, we'll be announcing more utilities soon, within those realms as well. Yeah, I think I also wanted to talk about the tribes, right? So I know that we announced the Mocha characters, which the artist I personally think is really cool, and they are really cute. I'm looking forward to use one as my PFP. So yeah, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the five characters and the five tribes. So we have dreamers, angels, builders, neocaps, and connectors. So what are the differences with those tribes?
Right. So I think, when we think of the starting point of sort of how Animoca was built and some of the principles behind it, I think we see with these sort of ideas of breaking down some of the thought processes of sort of the definition of, Animoca brands, and started with these characters, which may again evolve over time, right? But obviously you need all of these elements of these characters in order to sort of, build a new future or a better future, as it will. And I think things like dreamers and angels and builders and even connectors are probably fairly straightforward, right? You need people who have dreamers and imagination, or whether it's the artists, or whether it's the visionaries, or whether it's the futurists out there. You obviously need builders who are actually doing the work. Many of the companies you invest in are, those type of builders. You be a dreamer, but if you're not a builder, you can have all sorts of wonderful dreams, but if you have no action, things don't happen, right? Connectors are obviously the people who bridge everyone together, who create and sort of enhance the network effects that are being built around us. Angels are the people who help, and sometimes it could also be interpreted as a kind of angel investor, right? But I think the term that's perhaps most interesting out of all of them is perhaps sort of neo-capitalism, right? And neo-capitalism is a funny term because it's not really broadly used, and it's basically this idea that we as an organization do believe that capitalism is a force of good, but has recently been sort of as of late for the perhaps the last couple of decades really sort of been abused in a way where capitalism has been viewed by a lot of people in a negative way because it hasn't helped them in the way that it has past generations, because it hasn't provided them with the kind of income that they thought they would get, or for instance the kind of equity that they would have because of the holistic nature in which unchecked capitalism can up into, right? And neo-capitalism was really an early sort of economic thought that came actually pre-World War II, when the idea that it was a kind of capitalism that also incorporated a measure of social well-being, but that really respected basically economic freedom, absolutely respecting private property rights, right? But with a kind of moderated sort of economic planning, right? And I think one of the things that we see today is that we see these extremes, right, where people are saying, well, especially if you look at, for instance, America, which typically sort of railed against socialism, was never really a place where you could even utter the word. And if you look at, for instance, what happened just in the last 5 to 10 years, socialism is now actually a political movement, which can be sort of seen with the rise of someone like Bernie Sanders, which would have been almost impossible to imagine back in the day. But we see them, typically, unfortunately, somewhat amplified by social media in these extremes. Capitalism is either good or bad, socialism either is good or bad, but there's nothing really in between. And neo-capitalism sort of represents this sort of way in which you can still respect all of the main principles and tenets of capitalism, but introduce with it basically a kind of better sort of fairness and a better sort of sort of equitable framework where it still sort of respects basically private well-being, not exactly like social democracies, but sort of at least respects some of that, which then obviously would result in things like lower inflation, sort of better work conditions, public services, which of course in the metaverse has different meaning, and other things like this, right? And so this is something that sort of got lost a little bit, and I think in this age actually could be a reintroduction, as we are hoping and thinking that we can reinvent capitalism into the sort of positive force that it previously was, right? And I think this is sort of perhaps the most interesting term out of them, and perhaps non-obvious one in comparison to all of the other characters.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing that insight into the neo-capitalist tribe. I think everyone in the project team is looking forward to seeing our community members letting us know like which tribe they feel it represents them, and everyone in the who's been working on the project has found their own tribe as well. So look forward to seeing what everyone thinks about all the different tribes. Yeah, so maybe jump on to the next question. So we know that there's Animoca brands focus very heavily on the community, and especially for Mocaverse. So what role do you hope the Mocaverse community could play collectively? Are there any plans to onboard other members in the future, and what kind of members you reckon will be added the most value to the community?
Well, so I think maybe just to address the last one. I don't know that there's such a thing as to say that what is the most value to the community per se. We think that every member adds value to the community, both in direct and indirect ways, right? But of course, the thing that sort of got lost a little bit, and I think in this age actually could be a reintroduction, as we are hoping and thinking that we can reinvent capitalism into the sort of positive force that it previously was, right? And I think this is sort of perhaps the most interesting term out of them, and perhaps non-obvious one in comparison to all of the other characters.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing that insight into the neo-capitalist tribe. I think everyone in the project team is looking forward to seeing our community members letting us know like which tribe they feel it represents them, and everyone in the who's been working on the project has found their own tribe as well. So look forward to seeing what everyone thinks about all the different tribes. Yeah, so maybe jump on to the next question. So we know that yeah, so maybe jump on to the next question. So we know that there's Animoca brands focus very heavily on the community, and especially for Mocaverse. So what role do you hope the Mocaverse community could play collectively? Are there any plans to onboard other members in the future, and what kind of members you reckon will be added the most value to the community?
Well, so I think maybe just to address the last one. I don't know that there's such a thing as to say that what is the most value to the community per se. We think that every member adds value to the community, both in direct and indirect ways, right? But of course, we hope that everyone sort of feels passionate about sort of growing basically the space, because really, if you think about the kind of power that we'd like to introduce into the Mocaverse, it speaks somewhat to the power of Animoca's portfolio, right? Which is that you have a way in which you could perhaps influence or have at least a voice to sort of Animoca's sort of approach, whether this is in terms of sort of how it invests, what it invests in, or the investment it has made, what type of sort of impact basically Mocaverse holders could have in that. That's actually sort of the elements of that. And so what role would the Mocaverse community play in this one? Well, it would actually have quite an interesting role to play here, because it would be one of sort of providing their inputs, guiding it, basically thinking about sort of one of the things that we've spoken very often about, sort of what we're hopeful about DAOs, is that we think DAOs actually have a way in which we can really iterate on democratic principles. But it's hard to do that if you don't get to flex the democratic muscle, as it were. And now, actually, with something like Mocaverse, we can actually have multiple ways in which members could basically sort of start sort of using their democratic framework of a very distributed holding of NFTs, which would then have a way in which they could perhaps vote on certain things within Animoca, or perhaps even within group companies of Animoca that may make sense when the time happens, or at least have a voice in them, for instance, right? And so, who are the members that would obviously most benefit and most contribute to this are the ones who have a biggest interest in those areas, right? So, one of the reasons why the majority, and I don't think that we've released the details, but it'll come soon, but the majority of the NFTs will initially go to sort of contributors of the ecosystem. And these contributors of the ecosystem include not just people who are sort of companies we invested in or are shareholders, of which there are thousands of them at this point. So obviously that's already fairly distributed, but also to people who have played our various blockchain games, or have utilized our tokens in one way or the other. And and so on. So it basically tries to extend to the community at large. And obviously we'll expand from there, but initially we start with a smaller number and then we'll grow from there as we try to sort of help curate that community. And sort of you could say that this would be sort of the, I guess I guess the sort of Genesis Origin edition that is coming out. And the type of members that would want this are the ones who would want to have a way in which they have a say in this ecosystem, or at least sort of work with work with the community to sort of guide some of the directions of them, and have a way in which they're not necessarily priced out in some of those governance, because Mocaverse might find a way in which your voice can still be heard, but through a collective. Right, so I think this is the hope here, and so what we would want members to do is to become very sort of active and engaged with this one, because the platform of what Mocaverse can offer is a platform to multiple sort of, let's call it, metaverses and multiple environments in which there can be sort of community guidance, right? And so if you enjoy doing that, then this is absolutely for you. Some of them may be more passive, but still want to support it. There's also then obviously that's another way to do that. But ultimately, we hope to onboard basically as many people as we can in due course. But we have to obviously sort of manage this process as we sort of decentralize Animoca. We have to sort of decentralize basically sort of the approach in a, I guess, measured and careful way.
Right. So I think everyone heard some of the key points about kind of the eligibility criteria from your answer just now. So I think that's definitely one of the most asked questions that every community member is very concerned about. So is there any way that they can get in, or what exactly is the special eligibility criteria? What is it about, and who's included?
Well, I mean, I think the way that this, and I think the mechanisms on this one, the team is putting together, which, which I, I'm actually not involved in every single detail on this one, but the mechanism is in, depending on how involved and engaged you are, sort of with Animoca in the past, as well as sort of going forward, you receive essentially these entry tickets, right? And so these entry tickets basically become a kind of sort of way in which you can then have a randomized selection process depending on how many you have. So if you've been sort of engaged with the Animoca ecosystem for years and years, you'll have more entry tickets, which means that you obviously have a higher chance of receiving them. However, the more important thing, of course, is that the distribution is still intended to be fairly wide, meaning that just because you happen to have, for instance, let's say, let's call it hypothetically, if you happen to have millions of entry tickets, that doesn't mean that you have a chance of getting, let's call it, thousands of mint possibilities. That's not what's going to happen. You'll still only get sort of a chance for your 1 or 2 mints, for instance, that then gets distributed over a wide sort of range of people. So our interest here is to sort of distribute to a wide audience, rather than basically have a small percentage of people dominate basically the majority of this, right? And that basically is why the selection process is both sort of is extended and distributed intentionally between multiple type of stakeholders within the Animoca ecosystem, so that this is not something that can be sort of easily gamed, as it were, because that's one of the challenges, obviously, that sort of previous NFT mints have had. Even if they try to randomize it, you can still sort of open sort of thousands of different wallets, and you've gone through various experiences where this has been abused by one form or the other, because they can, and so this is one way in which using prior history, for instance, and previous engagement as a way of doing this. And the other thing, of course, is that means that many of these original holders, let's call it like for instance someone that we invested in, that we know is someone who understands the ecosystem, they would basically obviously receive NFTs in which they themselves, for instance, can then also distribute to various members of their communities. Again, not in large numbers, but a way in which, meaning that if you were someone who wanted to get this NFT, you may not necessarily get them directly from an Animoca mint, because there might not be enough of them, but you could get them because you were involved in one of Animoca's portfolio companies, or one of Animoca's projects, where they themselves receive essentially a certain amount of NFTs that they are free to distribute in whichever way they wish to, right? So in short, it's sort of decentralizing the distribution vectors of the way that these NFTs are handed over to the community, to ensure as wide as this decentralizing and redistribution process as possible. Some of this obviously is new and hasn't been done before. We're probably one of the very few companies that could do this because of our wide distribution of investments. But it is also, you could say, a grand experiment in decentralization. And obviously, we look forward, or perhaps are a little frightened as well, as to where this might all go.
Right. So I definitely think that got everyone pretty pumped up for the coming special eligibility announcement that's going to be coming shortly. So yeah, so in this case, maybe we can go into some live questions.
Sure.
Yeah, so
Absolutely.
yeah, so before the session, we've actually some questions from our community under our Twitter thread. So there's one question where asked by Eno888PH. Sorry if I butchered your Twitter handle. So the question asks, hi Yats, how does the Mocaverse NFT project measure the success of the accelerator program and the impact it has on participating startups and projects? So guessing this is referring to the build realm. Yeah.
Yeah, so probably, yeah, on the builder program, but for instance, specifically, we do have the ZK Launcher program, which is basically an accelerator that originally had the unfortunate name of being called Launchpad Luna, no association with Luna in itself, so we had to rebrand it. But that accelerator itself incubated, some 60 some companies, including the sandbox ones, right? And so these are companies that obviously would continue to sort of accelerate and grow in there. So a few ways in which you can imagine that NFT holders could get benefits. The first, and sort of participate, right? The first one obviously is, obviously seeing some of those portfolio companies early on, right? Basically, as we vet these companies and as we go through them, there would be opportunities in which the, Mocaverse holders could interface with these portfolio companies right from go. No different than, say, a mentor. And this basically is opportunities to learn, maybe potential opportunities to participate in them or support them, basically get in front of the door with some promising startups that we have sort of facilitated. All of these companies need to hire people. All of these companies also need to look for investment. All these companies also need different kinds of support. If that's of interest to you, I think Mocaverse holders, could benefit from that. The other thing, of course, is that going forward, Mocaverse NFT holders themselves will also then cover governance, right? Now, what that means is that on the series of governance sort of tokens that we hold, there are basically things like voting rights that go into them as well, which include, for instance, accelerator funding, which means that through a delegate approach, there would also be a way in which people can sort of have a say in supporting their favorite projects, for instance, which, as an individual holder becomes very, very difficult unless you happen to be very wealthy. But if you basically are a Mocaverse NFT holder, you have a way in which you can sort of, through a delegate approach, basically sort of collectively decide on a good outcome because, through this decentralized process of ownership, many of them can then basically agree on, I think this is the right project that maybe this foundation should be supporting, and we'll cast our vote this way. Whether that succeeds or not, obviously is entirely dependent on sort of, the entire community coming together. But in and of itself, it provides a pathway in which you could do that, which, previously perhaps wasn't available to them, right? But I think the other thing, of course, is that access to these companies and how, what they're building is perhaps also of great value for Mocaverse holders because they can learn from this and they can be inspired by this as well, and sort of build from there. I hope that answers the question. Wasn't really sure if that was the essence of the question asked.
No, I think that was a great answer. So now we have Ziana on stage. Do you want to please ask your questions? Feel free to ask anything about a project.
Hi, yes. I think I got kicked a bit earlier. I'm not sure. Twitter likes to rug. And hopefully I'm not asking something that was previously mentioned, but it definitely sounds like Mocaverse is catering to a lot of the already well-established community. But for those who are just wanting to get into the ecosystem and just be a part of what Animoca is building, is there a possibility for that to happen for some of those? If not, or is there, how would we be able to actually get a chance to be a part of Mocaverse and what Animoca is building for this project?
Right. No, that's a great question. So first of all, we do want to make this as inclusive as possible, but by nature of the fact that we're going to do this in stages, it might mean that, for instance, you might not necessarily be able to get an initial membership on day one. But we plan to sort of expand that as we sort of look at the spaces, which you can see other NFT projects have done that as well, and how they've expanded their audience sort of over time, right? So obviously this is part of the curation process. However, there is going to be a significant number of these NFTs available for broad community sort of adoption which can come in a series of ways, right? One of them could be participation in our game economies, which doesn't necessarily mean that you have to pay for anything. If you're an active member in the space, if you help promote it, if you support it or something like that, you can still receive, for instance, entry tickets. The other one, of course, is as being active community members in advance of the project. We've already seen some pretty cool fan art and designs and sketches and so on. These are other ways in which we could sort of look at from a bucket that will soon, the more details of it will be announced, but we think of them as essentially influencers and sort of brand agents and marketers of what we're building at Animoca. Right? These are other ways in which you could sort of receive that. So again, it's not necessarily one in which you have to pay for anything. It's one where you sort of show your effort. And if you don't manage to sort of get it the first time, you might be able to get it the second time. While the numbers haven't been sort of shown here, one of the things that we will be doing is that a number of these initial NFTs will be basically minted also to a DAO, in which community holders who receive the first set of NFTs have the ability to gift, grant, or sell or whatever to the to new participants and members in the space. And again, this is all part of it, right? Which is that, let's say, for instance, if you were not able to sort of get an initial NFT on day one, you don't have to worry too much about this in the sense that if you show that you've been a strong active community member and maybe you haven't yet established this, right? For instance, because you haven't been involved in the Animoca system years before, but you're now involved at this point, then the DAO itself can still give you an NFT because the community would say, you've been awesome, you've created great artwork, promoted it, or whatever it is that you've been able to do, and you could literally be gifted sort of an honorary NFT membership. The other thing, of course, is that you can do this also by supporting just a singular project, because they themselves will also be receiving these NFTs, right? So, all of our portfolio companies are entitled to receive some number of these NFTs, which means that if you're already supporting one or two of these projects, one of the gifts could be the Animoca sort of Mocaverse NFT as a, because you supported them so well, right? So there's multiple ways to get it, and not all are decided by us effectively.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering my question. I'll step down to listening.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as Yet has mentioned, we've been, reaching out to our portfolio projects who are, eligible for the initial launch of the NFT. And we've actually been receiving a lot of responses from project founders on collaborating with utilities, trying to create something new for our community. So yeah, next up, shall we bring in Azus?
Yo, good day, yo. So I got two questions for y'all. So my first question is, with Mocaverse, what are you guys running from, and what are you guys running towards?
So thanks for the question. I'm not sure what, maybe I'll try to answer this in the context of, if you say, what are we running from, or what are we running towards? Well, we're definitely running towards decentralization and digital property rights, right? So this is where we want to go, and everything we're doing is built towards that. And so when you think of if you think about actually how property rights really works, right, in the physical world, it actually works really well when you have, when it's decentralized, for instance, and when it's private property that is respected and that is governed in a manner that can't be controlled by a single entity. Because anytime something is controlled by any single entity, it doesn't matter whether this is physical or digital, for instance, call it, whether it's a dictatorship, a tyranny, a kingdom, whatever term you want to give, they may say that they respect your private property rights. They may say give you certain kind of rights, but at the end of the day, it is theirs to take from you, right? So how do you ensure that you don't have a way in which that can be taken from you arbitrarily? That's typically what a democratic framework is helpful in, which basically requires a need of a reasonable amount of decentralization, right? Because if it's not decentralized, if it's centralized, then they can always take it away from you. So that's really where we're headed towards, right? So maybe then to sort of take your sort of question in terms of what are we running away from? Well, we're running away from digital platforms that are centralized, right? We think of the world as one where we are currently digitally colonized. If you look at, for instance, what your existence on Facebook and Instagram or TikTok, or all these places which are obviously very powerful and influential, they are actually the ones who dictate it. They decide what we can see. They decide what we're allowed to consume, if you think about it. More importantly, they can remove us at any given time. If you go launch an app on the App Store, it's actually not for you to decide whether it can exist on that App Store. I mean, if Epic, probably one of the biggest game companies in the world, cannot launch the app on the App Store or on Google Play, it does say something about the state of the world that we live in. That's certainly what we want. And so when we think about, when you'll see the way that we aim to distribute the initial batch of NFTs with Mocaverse, you can see that it comes with a very clear perspective of decentralizing sort of that control and ownership right from the get-go, which is very much in keeping of the spirit of what we believe sort of Web3 is all about. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, sure you did. So I'm gonna hit quick with my second question. So
Sure.
there's this type of people. I always see them as a minority. So like there's some people like me and one dude, like two dudes I know, like they found y'all like back when your Mocaverse was still locked. Like I'll call them the gem hunters or the alpha hunters. Is there any way y'all like will try to hook those dudes up? Cause I think they deserve this. They're the nerds. They find this early before anyone even like had to think of it. So yeah, I just wanted to ask: is there any way in your plans, are you guys planning to help those people out, or just give it to them because they deserve it? They found your alley.
So, so if I understood the question is around sort of some of the early builders in the space, I think everyone who, I think the initial group of people in which, yeah, so we are sort of giving and working with them to get the NFTs on, obviously are the ones that Animoca knows, right? So obviously, that's obviously one element. But then there's the next level of people who are maybe involved in the ecosystem and are wishing to build and support it. Again, this is where the DAO comes in because they hold these NFTs. And even, remember, Animoca itself is aiming to decentralize itself, but it itself doesn't have a window of everything in the world, right? Like we would love to be able to know everything and support everything, but we can't, right? We're still an organization that has limited resources in terms of capacity and manpower. So decentralization solves that, right? By basically giving NFTs to a portfolio of over 380 companies, them to basically pass on to others. They may know those people that you're talking about. They may know who are the real champions of the space that may not be known to us, for instance. They then become as our agents to say, hey, this is a really valuable member. And Mocha may not have heard of you, but you're valuable. So here's this NFT, whether I sort of give it to you or you earn it or maybe sell it, whatever that approach would be. And that means that the moment they do this, they become known to us as Animoca, and we now know who you are because you hold this NFT and you have membership in this service, and your voice will then be heard by us, right? So that's sort of one part of that experiment to see sort of how far we can take this, because again, this hasn't really been done before. The other thing is when you talk about minority, remember when we talk about sort of the spirit of a true democracy, the whole point about a democracy is that minority voices can be heard, right? So it's not actually what some people think of that is a democracy, actually a sort of a tyranny of the majority. Actually, a true democracy actually has the voices of the minority heard, that they can be heard and respected, such there is a way in which there is minority protection, because it is in fact the minority that needs the protection. It is not the majority that needs this. That is actually one of the foundations of many of the most progressive democracies out there, as they think about sort of how do we ensure that the voices are heard, that we have free speech, that we have the sort of all the opinions we can speak of. The world is running a little bit in danger of that, as people forget basically that actually a democracy was designed to protect the minority interest, as opposed to just basically follow only what the majority wants, because the majority in itself doesn't reflect everyone, right? It reflects most of the people, but doesn't reflect everything. And we can see this in all sorts of divisions in society. That's why we have to respect them, but we have to listen to them so that we can have a dialogue and a discourse that is, that is something that to ensure that we can have proper discussions on these matters that can then sort of progress society forward.
Oh, that was a deep dive. Yo, thanks for answering my question. But I want to tell you, I don't think anybody knows this beat because our niche is still nascent. When you come to the gaming shit, like we just few who find this shit early and actually tell our audiences about this. And nobody knows us. Not gonna lie, no one knows us. So yeah, but it's cool. I'm gonna keep tab on y'all and I'm gonna keep reaching out.
Yeah, thank you so much for your
All
question.
right, thank you.
Yeah. So if you want to know more about the eligibility criteria, remember to subscribe to our Twitter, but also to follow our, co-creation partners. So like partners that we're announcing, on a regular basis. So yeah, if you support them, you'll be able to find more ways to see how you can shine within the community. Right. So next up, maybe G is us.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, thanks. Very nice to have the pleasure of speaking with you. Yeah, and have to say a special thanks. I've been in the space for quite some time and an long time, very active investor in the sandbox. And thank you for what had all of that and what it means to me and my family. My daughter's one of the beloved so-called Sam Fam members. We are extremely inspired by all of this. I come from motion pictures, and leaving my beloved career of since 1997, whatever many years that is, and looking forward to the decentralized. I was inspired by the DAO and the roadmap the Sandbox offered, etc. And Seb being an outstanding, peerless leader in the space, and yourself as well. That my specific thanks to you is along the way, as many of us, including your family, have had our losses. One of them was I lost my land, my Sandbox land included, and a gutter dogs, my beloved dog, my PFP. So you posted a very thorough investigative look at how things could unfold long term in your thread about how your son's assets were fished or lost, and that inspired me to stay in the space. And I got in touch with Carlos from Law Legal Line and Rug Radio, and have been an active member daily almost, and very much inspired by what this space offers and what you're talking about here. Unfortunately, and I'm not trying to FUD the space, and feel free to say, let's just take this offline in a sidebar personally, because I don't want to FUD it. But what I've experienced, including, and with all due respect, including from Animoca companies, let's just say the Sandbox, is a growing in the space, and let's not speak to the Sandbox because it's in the space and it's in human nature, let's call it that, and let's not speak specifically about any brands, but I've experienced the nepotism that I so sorely I'm repulsed by in my motion picture industry. It's absolutely rife. It was why the Me Too movement had to happen, is because people just shut up and keep towing the line. And so I very much am concerned seeing all of these go-to hands that are already demonstrating and evidencing nepotism that I've had to speak directly to Sebastian. Sebastian's the voice that's kept me in the game in spite of what I'm still continuing to. I've put a comment on the public blast here on the Twitter threads. I'm sorry for that. I had to speak up. I want to know what you're offering, because I'll tell you this. I came into the space, got land, and what wanted to build. We were locked out of the halls. My son is the master of a youth Freemasonic organization that requires access to a hall. What they teach the children is what you speak, parliamentary procedure, which is the framework, so-called Robert's Rules, etc., for democracy, for democratic process. It ensures all the voices are heard, etc. So I've been offering that since day one. I'm the original so-called SanFam member. There was a group of about 3 or 4 of us that started that whole thing, and I've been. We started a process, and one time put a bit of a. We offered a voice to something that became contentious in the community, and we offered our hall services because we were striving for parliamentary procedure, and we said, let's all get in here and not take on public socials and put it on blast. Let's have this on. Seb said maybe we should have a trial or something like that, and so we started this process, and I'll tell you, the community was completely repulsed for it. I got put on blast. My company got put on blast. I had, Seb took it offline with me and said, let's not do this. So this is very important stuff, right? None of us should suffer from this. And I'm still here in the game, but we are the pariahs of that community now for expressing things that are very important. And I'm trying to offer a mature voice to people who may have disdain for that, right? It's like, chill, daddy. We just want to have fun. We're just vibing here. And it's like, yes, but people's lives are at stake. And what you're doing by advantaging your friends is not cool with people who are bringing investors in, and you try to speak to that and you get more repulsed by that community. And so I wonder, when you're handing out these things to people who are in these companies, which are not known to you, right? Like, and this is the process. I understand what you're doing, and it is the inspiration is terrific, and your explanation of it in the previous comment was very concise and well understood by me. So I just wonder how you will approach this moving forward. The idea that our project, by the way, is called United Grand Halls, and we offer interoperability. We want it to be the halls, the United Nations of the metaverse, right? Very, very much speaking to what you're speaking of here. But what we don't want to do is hand out passes to other friends in councils and stuff, which is what I see mostly emerging in the space in Web3, new councils emerging. And that's not for the people by the people. That's handing out passes to friends who then have governance. And that is repulsing me. And I wonder what you can offer me as a mature person who's just looking for a good place to be me and do me and what I can bring to this world without studio execs and gatekeepers, right?
Sure. No, absolutely. Now, first of all, completely appreciate your question. I think it's a good one to have a conversation around. First of all, let me preface this by saying that we are experimenting in this space. So, and while I wasn't aware of the conversation you had with Seb, I think the fact that Seb was, willing to sort of embrace it and have this conversation speaks to at least the spirit of experimenting. But obviously, when a community has issues, whatever good or bad that may be, then there's also the voices that need to be heard here in this case. But here's the thing where the Mocaverse, and I understand what you're saying, can, or at least will try to be different in the sense that it is not about a single metaverse in this case, right? It is about what Animoca is touching, which is, in the future will probably be thousands of companies, sort of certainly directly, and then many more indirectly. But at this moment in time, over 380 plus companies within that group, plus the subsidiary groups itself, which include the sandbox. So, for instance, in your particular case, if you were looking to sort of advance a concept, you could, for instance, advance it through the Mocaverse. And that's not to say that, the delegates in Mocaverse would appreciate it either. Who knows, right? But at least there's another voice, another platform that can be heard in a way that has some influence because of the fact that it becomes a sort of, semi-proxy for some of the stuff that Animoca is involved in. Like when I spoke about sort of, for instance, governance tokens, NFT holders will then have the ability to use governance tokens of a variety of our projects, through a delegate approach to vote alongside them. How do we ensure, for instance, that this is distributed? Well, we ensure that because we try to sort of distribute, which you will see, the holdings of them in a very, very wide manner. While it's certainly true that of the 380 plus companies, maybe a small number of them might sort of know each other well and might potentially collaborate. But is it likely that 380 companies are going to do so? Not very likely, for instance, right? At least we think, right? So as long as we distribute it evenly and fairly across that group, then we know at least that bucket should be reasonably decentralized, right? Which means, therefore, in the hope and spirit of this, is that if it is decentralized enough, then, common reason, as in the best outcome for the most people, will very likely be the one that will succeed as the one that just basically looks to collude, which is the point that you're making, which is where nepotism comes in. When people say, well, since we own the majority of this, if I just talk to 3 or 4 other parties, then I can control everything and we can sort of create this facade and influence the space. That's obviously what we want to avoid. One thing that most people don't know about Animoca Brands is that even though we are a non-listed company, we are public. So we have 2,700 shareholders. And they also will be entitled to this. These shareholders don't know who they are. Some do, but most don't. And the size of their shareholding doesn't necessarily make a dent, because unlike what most people think, and that includes myself, none of us own majority in Animoca Brands. This is a feature that hasn't been much spoken about, because obviously we don't discuss. It's publicly available, but we don't discuss it. Generally sort of in the open. Which means even for myself, for instance, I don't have a situation where I have sort of, ultimate control of Animoca Brands in and of itself. I do need to seek the consent of, our stakeholders and our shareholders on key decisions. And that also means that we have a distributed base as well, which, these NFT holders will begin from as a base as well, meaning that we already start with thousands and thousands of individual people who have basically sort of, let's say, a kind of governance in those areas, which I would say most NFT projects don't have, because they only start from one root. They start from the root of an audience that is sold in a mint. And one of the struggles with the mint, as you probably well know, is that it's not just who has the most money. Sometimes it's also who has the best bots, right? Who has the best technology, who can go faster, because of the fact that they can sort of program this in a way that others can't. And so here we have a process where, through the portfolio companies, through our shareholders, through the people who have played with Animoca games and experiences, such as yourself or Sandbox previously, now have an entitlement to some of these tickets in which they can earn it. You can certainly game a system where someone can enter literally just 1 week before, or even a few months before. But you can't really game a system that easily, where you have to show what you've done for a couple of years, for instance, right? And in the past, this was done basically through these secret airdrops. And say, hey, you've been using, Uniswap for last year, so here's a drop for you. Sure, that's one way to do it, right? But that's more like a gifting system at this point, I would say. Here we can measure multiple activities because we have such a broad exposure to the ecosystem, where we can measure and balance it between a mixture of people who have been with the ecosystem for a while, such as yourself, but also for people who have just joined us recently and wish to participate, but as a ratio that is obviously more fairly distributed. So that's obviously the experiment. I think you will see through the distribution numbers we offer in terms of the way sort of a fair distribution. That's not to say that people can't buy it later on, but here's the other thing. If you distribute these NFTs to such a wide audience that already knows the ecosystem well, we're making also the assumption that the majority of them are not going to be just flippers, right? Because obviously in the past, NFT projects, because they could make money, would attract, a high number of speculators, which is what we're trying to avoid here. Again, I would say that we haven't sort of cracked it, cracked the formula. This is one of those attempts based on all the previous learnings that we are trying to sort of create this approach where it's more distributed and fair. But I totally understand, appreciate your comment.
Hey, I have a question. How you doing? What's going on? Yeah, I appreciate you being here. Can y'all hear me?
Sure, I can hear you.
All right, thanks, man. All right, so I've been building in the metaverse for a while, just kind of building across platforms, but following Animoca brands and the different companies that they're affiliated with. A while ago, you announced the Open Metaverse Alliance, OMA3.org, and then Mocaverse sounds extremely similar to the Open Metaverse Alliance. So is Mocaverse a branch of the OMA3 Alliance, or what will be the difference?
So OMA3 is an interoperability consortium, and it doesn't involve necessarily just companies that Animoca is involved in, for instance. It is basically anyone who is joining this consortium, which is an open standard. You can think of it almost like a sort of an open alliance of anyone who's basically trying to form interoperability approaches that are sort of free for people to choose from. In this case, it's not the same, I would say, because one of them is a standards-based body, whereas the Mocaverse isn't trying to be a standards-based body. It would work with something like OMA3 in collaboration, but it would not actually seek to become a standard in and of itself, right? So what you get, just to clarify, is like, OMA3, for instance, isn't going to be a platform where, for instance, you could vote, for instance, on activities that would take place in the Animoca ecosystem or in a portfolio ecosystem or in a governance token system. It wouldn't be involved in any of that type of stuff. It would maybe set the standards in which, basically, 10, 20, 30, 40 type of metaverses would agree to sort of, create interoperability standards for visual effects, for instance, right? That's, as an example. Likewise, you would not see Mocaverse basically sort of say, well, this is the standard that we're creating for people to sort of, transfer sort of interoperability from one entity to another. We think of that as something that the NFT platform itself should have the freedom to choose to do so as they please. And if they want to use the OMA3 standard, that's entirely up to them. The two are not really, I guess they complement each other, you could say, but they're not interrelated to each other. The people involved, we have, one seat out of many. We don't, we're not even, the chairman, I think chairman is Dirk from Upland, which is a portfolio, but it's certainly not a subsidiary. They're independent, right? So they get to decide what they think is right. So it is, I think it's to be viewed as quite separate.
Perfect. Thank you. Just that leads in just to the second question. You kind of segued in by mentioning Dirk from Upland, and that's one of the metaverses I use. Actually, I use a few different metaverses, but
Sure.
the Upland metaverse is my kind of my home metaverse as far as where a lot of my assets are located. So, do you a company like that, or how would companies become a part of the Mocaverse? Obviously, because that's where obviously you want to make sure. I'd like to make sure that my portfolio is within that atmosphere as well.
Yes, it would, because in this case, for Upland, Animoca actually is was a last lead investor, and obviously I myself am on the board of Upland, so that would definitely be encompassed in a manner within that ecosystem, and Upland would be one of the sort of recipients, shall we say, of some of these NFTs.
Thank you. That's all I had. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Cool. Should we get
Awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we have one last question, which we'll pass on to Christopher.
Hello. Yeah. Thanks for the great talk. I really enjoyed even after 12 a.m. in Hong Kong. So I'm Christopher. I'm a Sand fam. Good to see a lot of metaverse builders over here. Holder of the Maestro, and there are a lot of ways to introduce myself, but that's not a good time for today. So I'd like to relate this discussion to recent efforts of Animoca and creator royalties. I think you've been putting a lot of efforts into it. I can see that there have been some releases of public templates, agreements, and things like that Animoca brands have tried their best to protect the creators' royalties, right? But then now that I assume those transactions of this even Mocaverse NFT projects would happen somewhere like OpenSea, hopefully even in the secondary market as well, where in each transaction will let the creator make some financial income, and then hopefully maybe that's also the same case for Mocaverse NFT. So will the same thing happen to Mocaverse? That would be my first question, and if so, how does Mocaverse plan to reinvest such income for better utilities to the holders?
Okay, so first question. So in relation to sort of NFT royalties in itself, Mocaverse will be following basically the license approach that Animoca has put forward in public domain that other people can use, which we put out under Creative Commons license. The key distinction, just to be clear about the way that we thought of the NFT licensing approach, which is different from what platforms are doing, which is sort of creating essentially, I guess, block lists, for instance, in terms of, if they don't follow sort of, our NFT sort of, wrapper standard, then, we have the right to block it, which in some ways you could say is also a way to sort of curb competition, because I think many of the NFT platforms themselves are beginning to roll back into the we will respect royalty rights. But they're obviously trying to create ways in which they can sort of prevent essentially, I think, competitive action, which we don't think is a good thing. Instead, by basically following a legal approach, where trading of that particular NFT encompasses with it basically a sort of legal obligation by the platform to pay royalty rights. Otherwise, it is subject to itself legal liabilities. Is a way in which we can ensure that ownership, can always be respected. The principle being that if there is a way in which a platform can prevent your ownership of an asset to be utilized in one way or the other, then to what extent is it really yours, right? And where does it stop, right? So that's why we decided to take a legal approach with the licensing matter rather than a technical approach, which I know that a lot of people in the tech space, obviously, especially in Web3, sort of look at it as sort of a solution, which we understand, but they can be circumvented, with wrappers and other ways if you really, really wanted to. And at the end of the day, we do believe that we live, despite the fact that the metaverse is obviously a digital plane, we physically still live in a physical world with physical laws that obviously are mechanisms which were designed for good reason, and so we think we can use those to protect it. In the same way that you can protect intellectual property online, you should be able to protect your royalty rights online as well. So that's the principle behind that, and we hope to sort of develop that and obviously create a way in which all the NFT platforms will continue to respect that. Now, in terms of the sort of utilities, I think the as I had mentioned earlier, one of the things that we are looking at very specifically is ways in which basically, Mocaverse NFT holders ultimately some form of governance of a portion of the tokens that Animoca basically has, which is not insubstantial in terms of its sort of voting ability. It's not to say that we will put sort of everything in it. It's rather to say that we want to put a reasonable amount that has sort of a delegated impact into these ecosystems, but not one that is outsized, for instance. It's very important for us that, Mocaverse holders become a voice, but don't necessarily become the sort of dominant voice. Otherwise, it again threatens the sort of the framework and the tenets of what we're hoping to achieve here. So that's obviously a balancing act that we need to think about. But that's one way in which, I guess community members can think of sort of as a sort of value of service. We are not expecting Mocaverse to be a revenue generating event in and of itself. That's not how it's done, right? It's also not, frankly, for the business that is Animoca going to be meaningful itself. Rather, it is a way to sort of begin the sort of, I guess, the first step of, I guess, decentralized ownership through a stakeholder sort of capitalist concept with, people in the Animoca ecosystem as a starting point, and to begin sort of that decentralization, which then eventually would grow into other areas. We sustain and create revenues from the activities of our games and from NFTs and from our tokens and so on, and from the business that we run. So Mocaverse isn't itself going to be revenue generating. However, it has impact in governance. It has rights for access. You can sort of, it's like a membership service as well on top of that. And that's basically sort of, I guess you could think of some of the initial primary utilities. And of course, the connecting the network and anything else that you can derive value from Animoca yourself as an organization. The Animoca membership of this Mocaverse NFT should be able to provide you some service in the future, given the broad access of our portfolio. But again, this hasn't been done before. And I think we are one of the very few companies that have such a wide sort of framework of portfolios, companies, and activities that others could benefit from. So that's part of sort of the idea behind it.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I definitely agree with what you just said, and I think definitely there are a lot of uncertainties as this is early stage, and then also this is kind of a new model that you guys are trying. So I'll definitely look forward to it.
Thank you.
All right. I think that brings us to the end of our AMA today. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's tuned in with the questions, as well as Yat, for jumping in and answering them. So everyone drop hearts in the chat for Yat and the team here. Yeah, we'll definitely be looking forward to doing more of these chats with Yat, as well as different partners we have in the Moca Brands ecosystem. So do stay tuned to our Twitter and to the announcements to come. Maybe I'll pass it over to Yad if you have any closing words you'd like to give to the group.
No, I mean, first of all, thank you everyone for staying up so late. If you're in Asia, and if you're in other parts of the world, well, thank you for tuning in. And appreciate everyone's sort of participation and support in all of this. Obviously, we're still early in this, and I think one thing I'll close off in commentary. I know 2022 has been certainly a tumultuous year, and my general belief is that 2023 will be a much, much stronger year because essentially we've sort of gotten rid, hopefully, of most of the riffraff that basically sort of took place in 2022. And with everything that's happened in our industry, the fact that we're, as an industry, are not just sort of around, but actually I see, projects growing from strength to strength, token prices aside, builder activity is exciting, people are doing stuff, the space is still alive. To me, this is just a sign that actually we are we are still sort of, it's still moving very, very strongly ahead despite everything that's happening in the world. These are all things that could have been considered terminal by any other industry standard. And here we all are. So well done to everyone in the space. And thank you for believing in the mission of Web3.
All right. Thank you very much, Yad. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Stay tuned. We'll have more announcements to come shortly. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.